I'm Kimberly Gavin. Welcome to the webinar, Mobilizing Change. This evening we have some interesting guests with us. Just to tell you that we have people from small town Ontario, we have urban centers, and we have other provinces. And so I think you're going to find the evening really interesting. Chat with us, put your questions into the chat box, and we hope to get to all of them this evening. And if not, there will be more information on the portal later. So why don't I turn to my left and you can introduce yourself.
I'm Keenan Wellar from LiveWorkPlay in Ottawa. We've been helping people with intellectual disabilities and autistic persons to live, work, and play as valued citizens since 1995. Support about 200 people a year and enjoy working with their families in the community to make great things happen.
That's great. Thanks. Welcome, Keenan.
Thank you.
Hi, Kimberly. I'm Bruce Uditsky. I'm the CEO Emeritus of Inclusion Alberta. Inclusion Alberta is a long-standing family advocacy organization that represents the interests of individuals with intellectual disabilities.
Thank you for the invitation. My name is Brad Horne. I'm Director of Support Services at Community Living Parry Sound and Link Employment Services. We have been in the community of Parry Sound since 1962, and we have been what we hope is a very successful employment agency since early 2000s. And we support, again, about 200 families and people with disabilities in our community.
And the reason why we've gathered you here is because you're doing some really interesting things, and we're hoping that you'll be able to share some promising practices with our audience this evening. So why don't we take a few minutes just to get some clarity about third-party representation, because everybody here at the table is coming from a really different place. We've got small town, Parry Sound, we've got Edmonton, Alberta, Ottawa, all very different. And so what is third-party representation? Who are you? How do you come to the table?
Certainly, thank you for the questions. Very good questions. So Community Living Parry Sound, we have our Link Employment Services, which we ask families, we ask people with disabilities to reach out to us in terms of their employment needs and goals. And our agency supports people from when they walk through the door, and hopefully when they walk out the door that they've had successful employment opportunities. We use a number of strategies to promote Link Employment Services through social media, through a number of different employer engagements. We've been really successful at employer breakfasts every couple of years. We find that employers, business owners really like breakfasts. So 8 o'clock in the morning, get out by 9 o'clock. We showcase our videos. We have all our information there about our services in terms of what we do for both people searching for employment and also supporting employers and business owners in Parry Sound.
Excellent.
I would try to add to that. And Inclusion Alberta works across the province, and helping facilitate the possibilities of employment is just one part of what we do. But we have to work, therefore, in small rural communities, in mid-sized towns, for example. The difference between Edmonton and Calgary may not seem large to people in Ontario, for example, but they are very different communities. So we have to understand, just as I'm sure Brad knows his community really well from what I've heard, we have to know each of these different communities in terms of their context, their differences in culture, etc. But one thing is common, in effect, that we're in a way the bridge, the connector between individuals with intellectual disabilities, and in this instance, the employment community or the business community, actually. Right. So we're the intermediary, if we want. Right. The assurance that we're going to be there whenever we're needed over time, understanding really our role as a partner, that this is just not something we're putting on an employer, actually, but how we benefit as well. Those have been really critical to building those relationships. We have to be really on our game, actually. We cannot afford for people that are already somewhat stigmatized and marginalized, if you want, to have that further, their advancement in life further impeded by us not representing them to the very best possible way we can.
I would often explain it to families, for example, think of it as like a career placement service that you might use yourself. I might use it if I was changing jobs. And so although your son or daughter, they might not have a lot of experience, it's basically the same process. We're getting to know them, we know opportunities in the community, and we're trying to make a good match. So that's where the third party comes in. And I know where that's not available, you have families doing that themselves. But that's a difficult pitch when a family member is going to see an employer to try and pitch for their son or daughter. That's an unusual relationship, and is creating a lot of stigma, whereas we can have whether we're meeting employers through the Chamber of Commerce and have that sort of placement service conversation, so it's not creating some kind of a strange new world. It's just like, no, it's just a population you haven't tapped into.
Getting a job is not easy these days for anybody, and so what is it that you do, Keenan, at LiveWorkPlay that's different in terms of helping people to secure employment?
Well, I hope it's not too different, but I think you'll hear from everybody that knowing the job seeker really well is a critical step. And then the other piece is knowing our community really well and knowing the employers, because that's who does the hiring. And I don't think you'll hear it at this table, but I have seen some employment models where not much time is spent actually with employers. Too much time focused on the individual and the perception that you would somehow fix them and then they'll be ready for employment, where really people are ready and sometimes employers are not. So spend more time on that.
Getting to know the person is really important, right? What about you, Bruce? Do you
Well, I think one of the advantages we may have as a family advocacy organization is we get to work with families, and particularly thousands of families actually, from across the lifespan. So we can start with families when their children are really young age to encourage them to think about the possibilities of employment, to have that expectation, and to embed their sons and daughters as deeply as possible in the normative, inclusive pathways of life that contribute, in fact, to career identity development, as is true for anyone without disability.
Yeah, it's interesting when you say that, because often it's hard to think about employment when you're juggling a number of things, but having an after school or a weekend job and a job in the summer, working with people when they're younger is really important.
Yeah, I think what the research data tells us is that when families have a genuine expectation for employment when their children are young, for example, still in going to school and hopefully an inclusive education, it increases the prospects for employment post-school 5 to 6 times.
Wow.
That suggests something about the power, if you want, of families to have those kinds of expectations and to be basically embedding in their sons and daughters thoughts about what are you going to be when you grow up, what do you want to do, looking at your friends and people you're going to school with and playing with in terms of what their life is going to look like in terms of when they're working.
So keeping that typical path. Brad?
I bring a perspective from small town Ontario, and what we try to do at Community Living Parry Sound is listen to the person and be really person-centered about their hopes and dreams and goals of employment, and working with them to achieve that in our small community in Parry Sound. And knowing the employers really well is exactly what we try to do, as Keenan mentioned. Knowing your employers in the small town atmosphere goes a long way to provide those opportunities for people.
It's interesting that you both said to know your employers well, the people that are hiring. And so when you approach an employer, many of them have a preconceived idea about what it means to hire somebody who might have a disability. How do you deal with or address those underlying assumptions that people have?
Sure. I think the first is we don't lead with, I'm here to talk to you about hiring people with disabilities.
Right. Yeah.
We lead with, I'd like to learn more about your business, and of course specifically how you're doing with your hiring, and looking for gaps, looking for opportunities, and really getting to know them. And it's quite a while into the relationship before we'd be talking, typically even talking about hiring or proposing a candidate. That's way down the road.
Yeah.
It's building the relationship, understanding the business.
So let's run with that one. So you know the business, so you get to understand what happens at the actual location.
Right.
And then you said the gaps. Just talk a little bit about that. What do you mean by the gaps?
Sure. I mean, every employer's working on different challenges with their human resources. So it could be about retention. It could be about certain positions that, it's very transient. They're having people come and go. Or sometimes, example in the automotive industry, we discovered a lot of people, the inventory job was something they had people kind of doing on the side. And we proposed, what if someone, that was their job, the inventory role, which other employees often don't like, and we know someone that actually really likes that kind of work. And ended up having one dealership saying, yeah, this has been fantastic, we're saving money, the person's more accurate, and then went to other dealerships and said, you should really consider this realignment and hire an inventory person. So we ended up placing 6 or 7 people.
Right.
Yeah.
So knowing the actual business, knowing what happens in the store or in the organization, then figuring out what, like being creative and imagining what might be helpful to them, is that?
Yeah, sometimes, or sometimes it's existing positions they're having trouble filling, and we're like, oh, I think we have some people that fit that really well, and then you might have more success with retention, as there is a lot of evidence around issues of retention with our population. It's one of their strengths.
So when I ask you the question about how do you change the perception? So.
Sure. I think most employers are actually pretty open book, and if anything, we maybe have to undo some perceptions of what they've learned just by observing around. Unfortunately, there's still a lot of segregation that goes on in our community, and they may see that, oh, special people belong in special places. Right. And that's not their perception, that's just what they've observed, because unfortunately there's a mixed message in society right now. But we have just great conversation. We're like, no, actually they can work, want to work, and would be a great asset to your business. And I don't know about the two of you, but I found mostly that idea that the perception issue, it's pretty much easily adjusted, because they're pretty focused on, I want to hire good people, and if you've got good people, I want to hear more about it.
Absolutely. I think the perception that I come across with employers is their reluctantness to hire someone with a disability because they think they might have to end up firing that person. And I think that is one of the barriers. And as I talk to employers, no different than any other employee. Sometimes it just doesn't work out, and you have to do what you have to do for your business. I think the relationship with employers is paramount to success. And supporting employers, supporting their staff, education goes a long way to ensuring that a really good job match occurs and it's successful and it's a long-term relationship. And I know everybody around this table strives for that. And for me to stand in front of an employer and tell them, yes, you should hire someone with a disability, goes a long way in terms of a small community. But if I bring in another employer that's a champion employer that has been working with us for years, that is way more successful than me standing in front of them saying, you should hire someone with a disability.
Right. So business people talking to business people, employers talking to employers, saying this
Absolutely.
is how it's been beneficial.
And employer engagement with each other is really important to make a caring community of hiring people with disabilities, not for charity, but for business purposes.
I think in addition to that, what we found is when we have those doors open and take that opportunity and time with those employers, by virtue of the fact they don't really have a clear understanding of what an intellectual disability is or what someone can do, we can actually craft and create an amazing, increasing growing variety of diverse employment opportunities. In contrast to the history of the field, actually, where human services themselves have basically thought people could only do a limited number of functions. So the employers, by virtue of their lack of preconceived ideas, if you want, and our intersection with them, creates a greater array of possibilities than was, I think, previously understood. Employers talk to employers. When people with intellectual disabilities share their desire and passion to work and what it would mean to them to have a reason to get up every day and have an improved income, that can in fact result in employers responding to that. Here's somebody that really wants a job, wants to work, and is going to be a valued employee once we figure out the nature of the job for them.
And I think too, sorry,
Yeah,
Kimberly, and
yeah.
I think too that social connection that individuals make while at work stems the tide of loneliness, I think, that people typically have when they have a disability and they're not part of a network. So what we found when people are employed, that they develop a really thriving, interesting social network. So their friendships become natural and they enjoy all aspects, like we do, of being contributing citizens to the community by having employment. And as I like to tell our employers is, I want to be your HR department.
Right.
Yeah, and part of that work, I think some of that doesn't just happen, and I know you do the same, but when I say getting to know the employer, also how do things other than just job tasks, it's more than that. So what are your routines? What do people do for lunch? Do you have a softball team? All those kinds of things are really important questions to ask from the very beginning, and who's going to make sure the person is included in all aspects of the workplace culture.
Exactly.
And the big benefit for employers that we've learned from that is they will often say, you know what, we were actually doing a very good job of this with anyone that was starting with us. And we found out through this process, various people had felt left out or had missed out on things, and we have improved our overall ability to include and accommodate. Because there's lots of people that don't have an intellectual disability who are experiencing workplace isolation.
It's a different way of approaching work now, isn't it? The days of just looking for the job posting and thinking, okay, well, I could do that Saturday afternoon to stock shelves. So, the approach is different now. I've heard you talk about really knowing the employers, having good relationships, working from the get-go with families to be thinking about a typical and normative path, and then understanding the business so that the gaps are known and you can help people imagine what's possible.
It is, and I think that the use of social media that employers utilize now in terms of their business, how they recruit, is really important for us to understand and really be on top of in terms of where those businesses are going with their hiring practices.
So we have an employment task force and the same strategy of employer-to-employer conversations, and that's partly because of what Brad just mentioned. Some of the standard hiring practices, if that's all a company is doing to include, it's not going to work. And if you're not intentionally including, you're unintentionally excluding. And so we need pathways where if someone's made the decision, yes, I want to have a diverse workforce, it's not just going to happen from putting the ad out there. People with intellectual disabilities who have literacy challenges or technology barriers, that's not going to be effective. So we've used our task force quite a lot to have an employer-to-employer conversation, which sometimes is about how can we make your recruitment process actually effective for this population? Because what you're doing now, it's not going to work.
Not that whether one is using Indeed or one of those online recruiter initiatives that a lot of people are using today, actually is the personal connections and networking. Most Canadians still find their jobs actually through who they know, by word of mouth. Only a small percentage of jobs are actually advertised when you look at the total number of opportunities that are out there. So our partnership, for example, with Rotarians across 5 different communities. In Alberta, Rotarians are business owners, managers, and leaders. They're very well connected. They get together, in fact, to make a difference locally and internationally. And those networks, if you want, have been instrumental to us in being able to get those conversations that Keenan was talking earlier with an employer. We don't have them go out and say, we want you to hire somebody with a disability or intellectual disability. We have them talk about the fact that this is an organization they're in partnership with. This is, people that really want to work and make a difference in our communities. And would you be willing to entertain a conversation? And because they're connected, actually, people will get back to them. People do respond, and we do get those doors opening to have those conversations. Then it's up to us if you want to cement that relationship or partnership over time.
Yeah.
And that's a large part of my job, is that community engagement. And in Ontario, we have Rotary at Work, which we have utilized in our community for those connections. All the other service clubs that are in each community right across Canada are really important network builders to have that word-of-mouth contact.
Yeah, and there's typically chambers of commerce as well. And so Ottawa Chamber of Commerce, we're members alongside others. So we're at the table by rights, but also we're different and we stand out. And it's a great place to strategize about who we're going to sit with, who we're going to bring, what conversations we're going to have. And that's paid off. We also are Rotary members with one of the bigger clubs in Ottawa. And it's just a chance to meet people on a different level and connect.
So if we were giving a message to people about what most promising practice is, kind of top 2 or 3, not to put you on the spot, but what would they be? Is there something that you really want people to know that this is helpful if you start here?
We know that a post-secondary education in Canada, in general, results in better employment outcomes, better jobs, better pay, etc., for people with and without disabilities. And so our efforts to, over 30 years, to expand the opportunities for people to have an inclusive post-secondary education has proven tremendously successful, with 80% on average after they completed their studies, and they also work during the summer and so on, getting employment as a result of forging those relationships. Their professors and instructors are often attached to the community in different ways. They form relationships with their peers that they've gone to school with over 3, 4, 5 years. And so just as it is normative, if you want, for a certain proportion of the population to move on to post-secondary education, find out who they are, so to speak, what their interests are, maybe change their program over time, seek employment. This has also proven to us to be a very powerful way of gaining additional employment for people with intellectual disabilities.
I think it underlies everything that we've been saying, but I'll just make it more clear, which is an assets-based approach. So I think, Bruce referenced it's probably in human services. We have the biggest problem with using a deficits-based approach, and that is definitely not the way to lead with employment. You don't start discussing all the needs, accommodations, and problems. And so sometimes when we talk about making a good fit, just not to be too vague, sometimes it can also be like someone comes in and, well, they told me I wouldn't be good for employment because I'm really loud. And it's just, okay, where are places where people, it's a loud environment. I mean, or it doesn't matter. I mean, in a warehouse or something, who knows? Or there could be in the carpet cleaning company where people are talking and yelling over they're yelling over machinery. Or someone that wants something really quiet. I mean, there's all these environmental possibilities. It's a very diverse world of employment opportunities. And so I think just that underlying assets-based, and what Bruce mentioned a long time ago, the expectation of work, and that's something families can start from the earliest of ages, is just like your siblings or other people in the neighborhood or other students expect the same things, and the odds that it will happen are astronomically higher than if you don't believe it.
And talking about asset base, what we have found is that individuals that we are working with, if they have CPR, first aid, WMIS, safe food handling, their server intervention, that's what employers are looking for. So it's already set in terms of being successful as a job match, and trying to go beyond putting that early onus on training, orientation on the employer. We've already done that, and that works out really well.
And helps to build the CV, right?
Absolutely.
Demonstrates all kinds of capacity for people. So if we were going to get a real quick little cheat sheet for people, we heard, know employers really well, get to know the businesses, understand what the roles are that happens there, relationship all across the board. We heard typical normative routes for families, have the similar expectations that you do for your other children, early jobs, early chores, early opportunities. We heard about post-secondary education. Anything that we missed?
Employment's real and not a program, and I think sometimes families in particular, they may have been conditioned through like programmatic experiences that you sign up for it and then it just goes until you don't want it to go anymore. That's not a job. And I don't know about the rest of you, but I had an awful lot of jobs, especially in my younger years, things I tried, it wasn't for me, or the employer said I wasn't for them. And that's normal, and I think Brad referenced that. The employer has to feel comfortable with that, but so does the employee. And we have to be careful not to over pressure people. Like your first job has to last 20 years. It's an experience. We don't want anything negative to happen, but we want you to learn and grow and be able to say, food service is not for me. Office work is not for me, and that's okay. It's a learning experience, and move on.
So it's not a failure if you don't love your first job.
Absolutely not. I find that often people, it's 3 or 4 efforts, and they find something they really, really enjoy. Because you don't know what you like if you don't know what you don't like.
That's
So-
right. Yeah.
Options. I think providing options through different avenues of work goes a long way for that long-term success in employment. So it's it's real work, it's real pay, and that's part of life.
One thing I'd like to mention is about the funding if you want to support employment. So in our work, the vast majority of individuals, after some initial support, can be naturally supported by their colleagues and their coworkers. And those with more significant challenges may need additional on-the-job supports. But the more employment we've created, so we know jobs are possible, people can do the work, it's real, meaningful, gainful employment. But as that pool of people that are working increases and grows, you also need to be backing that up in terms of sustaining employment, wherein people run into difficulties and challenges, and in terms at the same time of adding more individuals.
Right.
And our funding streams across this country don't take that into account, actually.
Comments about funding?
Funding is not paid enough intensely, whether that's funding through the federal government or across the provinces. I think that, just echoing what Bruce said, that if we as agencies had greater access to funding, that you would see much more success in employment.
Funding, the way we've described, actually results in greater cost benefits to all of us.
Yes.
Funding people to remain unemployed for the entirety of their life is very expensive, both in terms of wasted lives and in terms of the cost of doing that. So in fact, we are not spending the dollars in a way that truly is cost beneficial in terms of the return on the investment in assisting someone to be gainfully employed. And even though the figures are there to justify that, it's still difficult to change systems to accommodate that reality.
And that's one of our biggest barriers, what you just mentioned.
Yeah.
So I'm sure there are a lot of families watching the webcast, and they're probably sitting thinking, so what do I do? Where do I even start? You've talked about your organizations and the work that you're doing. What would be the approach? What do they come to you asking for?
In this day and age, if it's possible for a family, I would definitely do some background research. What's the evidence, first of all, that they've had success with individuals like my son or daughter? And what's their approach? What kind of fit can I discern from the videos and the information, so that their first call, they're coming with some information and some questions, and really tasking us at the other end with, this is what I need. How does that fit with what you do?
So what would be some of those great questions that a parent could ask? So key questions. What do they need to
I
know?
think, how are you going to get to know my son or daughter? Or they might lead with some information about their son or daughter and say, given that, how are you going to get to know them and make a good placement or support them properly?
I think the question that we get is, can my son or daughter find a job? And we're absolutely.
Right.
And that's our goal, bottom line. Everybody can work. And that's what we tell them. And we use our videos as really powerful storytelling. And storytelling goes a long way for informing families what we do. And
Because
how
we
can
know that there are people watching that think, well, that might work for somebody else, but
Exactly.
not my son or daughter, because of whatever the fill in the blank is. So what's the approach?
So I think, well, again, we're a bit different in that we're a provincial-wide organization that does many different things in relationship to families. So there are a large number of families already connected to us, knowing they're going to be seeking employment,
Right.
for example. In fact, we have more people coming to us for employment, and we have to limit our pool of people at any one moment in time, and given we have limited capacity to generate employment. We could generate more employment if we were in fact funded. I think there are, of course, families have to see the possibilities. You have to give them some of the tools, if you want, or the means by which they can basically see that their son or daughter is a unique individual with personality, with interests, with passions, etc., with desires, with gifts to bring to the community. And that's a process over time.
Right.
And as that unfolds, we can sometimes align that with potential employment opportunities. I think we're still not doing as well for people with most severe complex disabilities as we are doing for people with less complex disabilities. But I think it's probably true in all our instances. We find successful employment for large numbers of individuals that have previously been deemed unemployable.
That's just a vicious label to
Yes.
put on somebody. I know all three of us have had experiences. I lost actually count of the people that came with that label. And this is what can be very frustrating, is sometimes people see our videos and they go, oh yeah, but that person can work. I'm like, yes, but there was a time when someone said that they couldn't. And so their disability didn't change. They didn't change. Someone's expectations around what they could do. That's the only change. They're the same person that had that label.
The paradox when
Yeah.
we show these videos or people share their stories through slides or whatever of people being included in employment or other aspects of life, in many ways, the severity of their disability, if you want, drops away.
Right.
And so a family is looking at this saying, oh, that's not like my
Right.
child,
Right.
because they actually haven't shared in a similar experience, and you have to help build that bridge and have them understand the difference context and environment makes in how people are being perceived and understood.
Well said.
I
good
think
point.
too that I had talked about employer champions, but we also have champions that work. And having them talk to families is really powerful. So if someone's been at a particular business for 10 to 15 years, it's about talking to the families and their sons and daughters about their work experiences. And that goes a long way to inform families about how we can help.
Great. Can you talk a little bit about some of the things that have been barriers or not necessarily helpful in terms of training programs?
I know, for instance, large debate happens, and it's been happening since I've been here at Community Living Parry Sound, and the issues, the pros and cons of wage subsidies.
Say a little bit about what that is for people who might not know.
So throughout Ontario, there's a number of agencies that are funded to provide wage subsidies for employers to hire individuals with disabilities.
Right.
And during that time frame, whether it's 6 weeks or 8 weeks, what we have found in our experience that after the 6 weeks or after the 8 weeks is up, then the person is, thanks for coming out, but there's no longer a job. So I have heard advocates that have stated that the wage subsidy gets the person in the door for the employment. Again, that debate rages on.
Gets them in the door, but with what expectation?
Exactly.
So you pointed to the end of the wage subsidy, but I also think that problem goes to the beginning of the wage subsidy, which is the approach. You're selling the person as less than from the first
Exactly.
minute. Now we'll use, if there's something that is applicable to other job seekers, like maybe summer employment, I think there can be a good case for summer employment wage subsidies,
Absolutely.
which is available to all
Yes.
student employment and that
Well,
sort
you
of thing.
know,
Yes.
Yeah, but that's where the employer is investing in a very short period of time. They're training the person, then they're leaving. I think it's a fair
Yes.
exchange by society
Yeah.
versus something that's disability specific, or I think is just setting up, like we don't use them, it just sets up
Yeah.
an expectation. But I mean, you referenced some really good examples of training certificates and things you have to have for certain types of work. We would take the same perspective. We don't provide that ourselves. You go off, we support the person to go off
Exactly.
somewhere and do that alongside others. Again, it's not a disability specific thing. But this idea, we don't do the come for 6 weeks and we'll get you all trained up. I mean, it's a very individualized. I find it would, for us, it would be a waste of time and resources. We'd rather focus on getting to know that one individual. If they need some specific training, we would support it. But really, we'd be more interested in finding the right match.
These, wage subsidies, I am clear in my opinions, if you want. They don't work, actually. And they're a barrier to employment. They imply somehow the only way you're going to hire this individual is if somehow you're offset in terms of your cost. And so immediately somebody is in effect devalued in terms of their capacity and abilities. And they don't result, that is quite clear, in long-term sustained employment. What they do result in, so a few years ago the federal government was spending $30 million a year on wage subsidies because in fact you can say people are employed. And so your unemployment data decreases. If you put people in training programs, you don't have them recorded in terms of being unemployed, and if you deem them unemployable, they're not counted. So we have a huge population of people, in fact, who are, in a way, pushed out of the labor market. That we expend an awful lot of funds on. The data also is very clear, because people just don't believe me if I don't reference the research for some reason, that the longer you're in these training programs, particularly people with intellectual disabilities, the far less likely it is that you're actually going to get a job and be employed.
Yeah.
So job training for those of us without disabilities has been our life pathway, actually. And then we may have had post-secondary or technical institutes or vocational training afterwards. That's actually inclusive in a way, if you want, where people with intellectual disabilities should be learning alongside us. If alternative approaches to employment actually worked, we would be in there first, and people with intellectual disabilities would be on waiting lists
Yeah.
for those programs, actually.
And not to
That's
speak
not
from
the
the
way it
mountain,
works.
because I will own some of the foolishness of past efforts at LiveWorkPlay, where we had internal things that were designed, well-intentioned. We thought, well, they're not getting hired. Maybe we can make them more acceptable to the labor market. And like, oh, actually no. A way better use of time would be to actually talk to employers, and there are jobs for these individuals. And that we're creating the barrier by keeping them here, where being in a social services office has nothing at all to do with employment. So why are we doing this? And thankfully, we saw the results. It's not working. People aren't leaving here and going somewhere else. So what are the strategies? And we got involved with things like Canadian Association for Supported Employment, Ontario Disability Employment Network, Parry Sound, like who's doing good things?
I think we've underestimated over the years the capacity of community actually to be welcoming, inviting, and embracing people. And so I think we found, in fact, whether we're talking about post-secondary institutions or recreation and leisure providers or the business community, that there's far more opportunities than previously was imagined.
I'm kind of wondering too about the approach around volunteerism. So yeah, people are welcoming and receptive, and then if you're not clear on how to use the opportunity, some people will jump to, well, let me convince you that my family member is employable or this person is employable by volunteering. Does anybody have any thoughts on?
It's real work, real pay. It's simple as that.
So volunteerism for us, because we support not just employment, we do housing and also, so that for us is in the community engagement sort of profile.
Right.
If you're interested in, like people that volunteer with festivals alongside other people, but we don't, it can be, it could be a path or something that leads to employment, but that is not part of our employment support services.
So it's more around the civic roles that people
Exactly,
have.
for
Okay.
people that want
Yes,
to
volunteer.
give back to a cause
Yeah.
for a voluntary organization as a volunteer alongside others.
Right.
Absolutely, if that's
Yes.
your interest.
So,
Volunteering for what other people are actually paid to do
Right.
is exploitation.
Yes,
actually.
absolutely.
Okay. So somebody should have the opportunity to volunteer in meaningful ways. The same is true for anyone else.
Across the country, there is a mixed message around that, and as a strategy, we certainly don't like it, but I mean, others in Ottawa use it, and that's really hard for me, because I've had conversations with employers, and they've said, I get those people for free. And I'm like, wow, what are we doing? What a disservice. Like, this is the lowest of the low when you talk to an employer and they've been taught by somebody that a person with Down syndrome works for free. I mean, this is...
And makes our job incredibly hard
Right.
to get over that stigma
right.
in terms of real work and real pay.
and just sad. When there isn't an opportunity for a job or to join another organization or a company or a business, some people will look to, should I create my own? What do you think about entrepreneurism?
Well, I'll just say, if it's because the idea is that the person can't work somewhere else, I think that's a bit problematic, versus it should be like any other person that decides to start their own business. It's not because I couldn't work somewhere else, because I choose. I would rather own my own business or drive my own future in that particular way. So I think as a sort of a give up, I don't know that it's the best strategy.
If this person has an entrepreneurial spirit, actually,
Right.
then that's something potentially to pursue. But trying to have somebody do that when that isn't part of who they are actually doesn't hardly ever actually works. Most small businesses in Canada that start up, I think it's somewhere 30 to 40% fail within, what, a year, 18 months, okay? It's you're not guaranteed success. And many of the small enterprises I know are usually individuals, and they're not usually completely viable. They're supported by families, by networks, and that's fine, actually. People are meaningfully engaged. Some of them really result in people being connected to their community. Of course, you could do a small business in your basement and never, interact with the real world. So you have to look carefully at what it is and who are the people with you that are going to invest their time and energy, and sometimes their money actually, in realizing this. So we do have people, we do have materials who have started their own businesses, others that could do that. Some clearly had an entrepreneurial spirit. They're doing great. But they continue to require others to be engaged with them, such as family and allies, for that to be sustained over time.
Because if you think about it, entrepreneurial, you need to be somebody who can figure out how to market your product or your offering. You have to be able to do the accounting, to run the actual
There has to be a
business.
need for it.
It's really, really complicated, right? If it's going to be sustainable and if it's actually going to bring in an income, it's a huge undertaking.
And the issue of informed choice can be really tricky around that, because if the person's had really bad employment supports or really negative experiences, well, how informed is that choice? Like maybe if they had a better employment experience, a better support, they would be quite happy working for an employer. But if it's, or maybe the family too, they've had enough. Like maybe there's been a series of negative experiences and they said, forget it, we're just going to create something, I had enough of this. And we can't, what can you say? That's their experience. And so I think it just calls us back to, we need better employment supports. We need better preparation and expectations throughout high school, post-secondary opportunities, everything we've talked about to offset people making choices because they don't see an alternative, which is very different from just being excited about running our business. And
So it's not ever instead of a job, unless you're called with that spirit.
It's one of the options
Yeah.
that people without disabilities pursue.
right.
Because they want to have their own business,
Right.
and this should be and is one of the options.
As we talk to people who do want to move towards running their own business, it's what's your business plan? Let's help you do the business plan. Let's see if this is actually sustainable. And I think that process does open the eyes of people that we support in terms of what a real entrepreneurial job is by going through the business plan.
When the bank will loan you startup money based on your business plan,
Yes.
you have
Right.
You've got
potentially a
something. You've
viable.
got
Yeah.
something.
Yeah, that's one measure for
and,
sure.
and we have had individuals
Yes.
be able to do that, actually.
What would be your final message to families?
I think for us and small town Ontario, again, I go back to is let us be your network. So let us do the work and come and see us and we can help. That's what we want to do.
Don't do it alone.
Don't do it alone. We're there to help.
I think for families that don't yet have that expectation or are doubtful, ideally to be open to learning about the possibilities, okay? To investigating them further. What's pretty clear is that I think families play the greatest role, and not everybody has family, unfortunately, in their lives, but they do play the greatest role in successful outcomes for individuals with intellectual disabilities. While not everybody has a family, you haven't figured out a way to replace that. So if you're in that role, okay, it actually, you have a tremendous responsibility and opportunity, in fact, to make life-changing differences.
As family members, you know your son or daughter has value, and I know there are days when you feel like nobody else does, and that is super painful and super heartbreaking, but you have to believe that others will discover that value, because what's the alternative? It's not very appealing. But I would also just say, and all of us can speak to this, from experience, the other people in your community who will value your son or daughter are out there. You haven't found them yet, and take advantage of any help you can get, whether it's an agency or Rotary clubs, whatever it is. Be there where there are communities of caring people who will see that value and operationalize it as employment.
So don't go it alone. Stay open-hearted and open-minded, and find others that will be your champions and cheer you on to stay the course.
Yeah.
Got it.
That's
Thank you.
great.
Thank you.
That's great. So thank you. I'm welcoming people to actually stay tuned as we tackle the questions that you're posing for us.
Hi, folks. We wanted to get started on some of the questions. I hope you can hear me. If somebody can just give me a signal that you can hear me, that'd be great.
Yes, Kimberly, we can hear you.
Okay, perfect. Thanks so much. So lots of questions. Great conversation happening in the chat off to the side. So I'm just going to try a couple of really quick, simple ones to start. So Brent asked if somebody could quickly just define what an employer champion was. And I think all three people used the phrase employer champions. So Bruce, Brad, Keenan.
Who's going to go first? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, yeah.
Okay. I mean, for us, the simple definition is just that it's any employer who's hired at least one person with intellectual disability and is willing to speak to the benefits of that to other employers. Beyond that, we have some very specific roles we might ask of them, but essentially that's it. They've done it. They can speak to the benefits of it. They can speak to the relationship perhaps with us that helped make it work. But that's it. I mean, employer champion has employed someone and they're up to champion the benefits of it.
Great.
Can you hear me? I would echo that, particularly when we've been fortunate to have recognized business leaders, actually, who have standing in our province or community, take this on, almost a form of evangelism, if you want, in promoting inclusion, and particularly how it's been of value to them. That in many ways they've gained more from it in terms of their ethic of their workplace, respecting each other's differences, in fact, than the person with a disability they've employed might be gaining. And I think that's been quite powerful when other employers hear it directly from somebody who's sort of put their money where their mouth is, so to speak, in contrast to my preaching at them, if you want.
Not that we mind a little preaching from Bruce. Dean, you had a really interesting question. Do you think there's as much a lack of knowledge about community employment support resources available among families as there is among businesses? Who wants to chime in?
I can go again.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I think to be fair, it's a bit confusing. So if your child has an intellectual disability or autism, you're probably most familiar with developmental services. And developmental services agencies aren't necessarily who's offering employment supports in your community. That is often through the Ontario Disability Support Program employment support. So I think that's one mix-up. We don't really have a straightforward one-door system. There are some changes in Ontario that may or may not help with that. But I would say for families, it's because there is that confusion between the two systems, and they may not always hear about those opportunities. They should hear about it through school long before they graduate, but unfortunately that also is not working well. And then certainly for employers, it's hit and miss how they would come to have this information, which is part of the reason why all of us have joined things like boards of trade to get that message to the employers. It's still not a way to reach all of them, but it certainly helps a lot.
Anybody want to add to that, or is that good?
Well, the only other thing I might add is, I think everything's been said is actually right, but I would add to that, if I understood the question correctly, making every effort to connect to other families that have walked or attempting to walk this path beforehand. much as we all might like and think with the internet, all the information is out there, it isn't a simple, straightforward, easy path to negotiate or to find. And often, in fact, being with and connected to other families that share the same hopes and vision, have been seeking or have secured employment, can be one of your best sources of information as to what to do next or where the possibility might lie.
So real strength in people coming together and sharing and learning from each other, right? Absolutely.
It's been the case for over 60 years.
Yeah, yeah. It's amazing how powerful that space for people can be. Carrie, you asked an interesting question. Welcome. Hi, Carrie. You asked, what about when there isn't a third party around, employment service provider around, when there's nobody locally? What should people do?
Well, one of the things we recommend, not that it's panacea or a magic solution, is because, as others have mentioned as well, networking is so critical to creating the possibility of employment.
Mm-hmm.
And so families can really look at their own networks, who in their network is connected to who actually. Sometimes it may not result in a job opportunity for your family member, but actually someone else. And then someone else may have an idea. So often when we first ask people, who do you know? They say nobody or hardly anybody. So it actually takes a bit of work to sit down and figure out who you might know in your network. Mm-hmm. And also can be a challenge and to figure out how you're going to ask. People don't like to ask. If you're Canadian, you'll probably say, I'm sorry, but I'd like to ask you. But getting to the point of being able to ask, I think can be a challenge for some families, and they need to reflect on that and realize if they're not actually asking, the possibilities unfortunately diminish. And it's interesting to see how that network can expand and grow if you ask your cousin, who do you know, and who they know, and you might find, in fact, somebody that you can entertain a conversation with in terms of employment prospect. And then again, it can be a challenge in terms of locating supports if you're in a place that is very rural or remote or disconnected. Right. And you can still connect to others, at least remotely if you want, or through emails or other forms of the web, in order to get some advice and information on where you might be able to find some support to initiate employment and then sustain it over time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Keenan.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to say every community does have some third parties in a way, in that you could use some of the same strategies like Rotary clubs that have been mentioned. Almost every community, no matter how small, they do have some sorts of community gathering places, and they would be a great place to go and look for help, to ask for 5 minutes, to have that kind of conversation. And within that network, there will be employers, and there may be some possibilities there. Just wanted to mention that.
And you mentioned earlier Chamber of Commerce and all of the typical places that employers go and business people go and hang out, right?
Exactly.
Just that today, sorry, yeah. Kimberly, very popular today are business networks.
Right.
Sometimes for young entrepreneurs, for women entrepreneurs, etc. And those exist actually in many communities where they come together to discuss their issues and challenges and how they're proceeding with their businesses. So right. You can think of service clubs, of chambers, but there are actually other networks as well you might be able to locate and find.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great idea. There's always people looking to join the conversation around the women's business networks. I know that for sure. This question is kind of a build on that one, Keenan, and you might be able to speak to it because you mentioned the interviewing, knowing about the culture of a business, like what happens also in the workplace culture around breaks in sports teams and after hours stuff. If you don't have a third party that can do that kind of sussing that question out, how do you think a parent or a family member might actually pose that or go about finding out that information from an employer?
Yeah, I mean, I guess they could try the very same strategy, which is just to say, I'm interested in learning more about your business, and see if you could get yourself a tour or a conversation, which is basically the way that that we would approach it. But also, like Bruce had mentioned, and some of the examples I had mentioned, there might be, ideally, I think, if you can find a third party, an individual through one of your networks that has a connection that could perform that for you. I think it's nice to have that buffer so that it could be awkward as a family member. I'm here to explore an opportunity for, my son or daughter. And so if you could find a way that someone in one of your other communities or networks has a natural connection to that employer, and even could facilitate or join you in that kind of a meeting, I think that's ideal, because we also do that. We would prefer that someone else that already has a connection invites us or sets it up so that it's more natural and a bit less of an out of the blue approach.
Yeah, and I'm reminded earlier in the actual recording, you had talked about, all three people had talked about really knowing the employers. So it's not like you're going, here's Susan's resume and hey, what happens at break here because she wants a job. Like, it's about really knowing the workplace, the employer, what goes on, and that's hard to do sort of as a one-off, right? Going in visiting. Okay.
I would add, in some instances, the culture is actually more important than what the job is. So you have to know the individual as well.
Yeah.
And the right culture, for example, being a very good fit, may be more important to someone's interest in sustainability than, in fact, the job. People don't always recognize this right away, but it's something for families and others to keep in mind. And I think Keenan also mentioned a very good point when, in fact, he reflected, ask indirectly. Don't ask right up front, actually. And that opens people up to be thinking about what they might do as opposed to more direct asks. So I thought that was a very important point to reiterate.
Yeah, that's great. I'm intrigued with the answer, so I'm losing track of the questions. Let me just back to the questions. So Kathy, some businesses will create a peer mentor with another employee. So is that something that people are suggesting is a good strategy, just to be known? And I'm repeating kind of your question/statement because I'm not sure everybody saw it. So what about peer mentoring at work? Good strategy for people's success?
I think, like everything else we talked about, has pros and cons. So going back to Keenan's point as well, if you're getting to know the employer well, you may find people in the employment context you're looking at who are naturally the people who take people in initially, who are the office or shop floor gatherers and connectors, and they are the natural people doing that in the workplace. So you might look there first. It might take a little time to see where connections can be actually forged. So if you simply seek a volunteer, and worse yet, appoint somebody, that works less well, actually. But if you seek a volunteer, you need to be clear what the roles are, and you have to be very careful they don't get in the way of the person forging relationships more naturally with others. We tend to use peer mentors in our work more often with high school age students who are working outside of school hours in the typical jobs people of that age work in, where they are therefore supported by peers of a similar age and interests, so there's no stigmatization, but we actually work with those peer mentors to understand their role, to the employers to understand their role, and how they could hopefully fade out in time. Works much better, for example, than if I were to be the peer mentor for a 17-year-old, for example, clearly I would benefit greatly from it, but the 70-year-old would be highly stigmatized by having somebody who's standing, me being in that role, for example.
Right.
Right. I think you need a clear go-to person, just as any other person would have in onboarding. So who's my go-to if I have questions? But I would be hesitant to create anything that's not a natural part of that workplace, because you could end up attaching all the responsibility to one person for things that really the whole team, the supervisor, and everyone should be involved with in welcoming that person. And that can easily happen where, oh yeah, Joe helps Susie. No, you're all a part of this team, and if you're having challenges or difficulty communicating, you have to resolve that as a team and not rely on one person, for the obvious reason that first of all, it would alienate from the rest of the staff, but also if Joe quits, Susie's really in trouble. And so we don't want that. We want a team effort. We want it to be as natural as possible. And so if they use a peer mentoring or something as a normal part of their onboarding, then of course, but we don't want to create something that's sort of disability specific and could undermine the future relationship.
Great. Thanks. There is just a barrage of questions, a list. It's quite lengthy. And so I apologize that I just know that we're not going to get to them, but we are going to find a way to get these questions that you've listed tonight onto the portal with some responses from people. I don't know how we do that, but we will do that. We will commit to answering the list of all of your questions. I'm getting the signal to wrap up before I get cut off, so I'm going to do that. But I just wanted to thank everybody for coming out tonight, spending the time, setting an hour aside to have this conversation, and thanks to our presenters. The fsne.ca portal will have lots more information being posted over the next little while for you. We're also creating space for families to get together and connect and share experiences and resources and stories and be inspired by each other, to cry and celebrate, whatever it is, but to do it together and not do it alone. So I encourage you to look towards the portal. And I also think that this workshop was called Mobilizing Change, and I think change is going to happen when there are families looking at services a little more critically, knowing what their ask is, what they're looking for, not just accepting the menu that's being offered, but being clear on what you need. And I think that you'll become clearer the more time you spend with others who are also considering this topic. So thank you everybody for joining. And I promise there will be great resources on the portal coming up soon and the answer to all of your questions. So have a wonderful night, and thanks everybody. Signing off.
Thanks, Kimberly.
Bye.